The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Portland Federal Courthouse as climbed them slowly, deliberately. She gripped her leather briefcase the necessary, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of what she was about to do was literally pulling her downward. Her navy blue blazer, carefully chosen to project authority and professionalism, suddenly felt too tight around her chest. She could barely breathe. It was 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late March, and its entire career, everything she had worked for over the past 15 years, hung in the balance. She had always known that being an expert witness might happen someday, but she had never imagined it would be like this. Never imagined the stakes would be so impossibly high, not just for her professional reputation, but for a man's freedom, for the integrity of an entire system. The courthouse doors swung open before her, and immediately the temperature dropped. The air conditioning was aggressive, almost hostile, paused in the doorway, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim interior lighting. The hallway stretched before her like the corridor of a cathedral, long, imposing, echoing with footsteps and hushed voices. Other people moved past her with purpose, but felt frozen, caught between two worlds, the world of scientific certainty and the world of judicial uncertainty. She made her way to the third floor, taking the elevator alone. The numbers climbed, 1, 2, 3. With each floor, her heart rate increased slightly. By the time she reached the third floor, she could feel the pulse in her neck, strong and insistent. She pressed her hand against it, trying to calm herself. This was ridiculous, she thought. She was a scientist. She had data. She had peer-reviewed research. She had truth on her side. But truth, she was learning, was sometimes the most dangerous thing of all. The courtroom doors stood open, and could see the space inside was already crowded. Journalists filled several rows in the back, their notepads and recording devices ready. She recognized a few faces, local news anchors who had covered the initial arrest. There were also lawyers, the defense team on one side, the prosecution on the other, arranged like opposing armies awaiting battle. And then there was Officer, sitting beside the prosecutor's table, his German Shepherd police dog, Rex, lying peacefully on a cushion beside him. The dog's amber eyes were alert, intelligent, completely unaware of the controversy surrounding him. His breath caught in her throat when she saw Rex. She had studied the dog's behavioral patterns for months now, watched video after video, analyzed frame after frame. But seeing him in person was different. He was beautiful, a magnificent specimen of his breed, muscular and alert, with the kind of presence that commanded respect. Rex had been trained from puppyhood to detect narcotics. He had participated in hundreds of traffic stops, and according to official records, he had never made a false alert. His accuracy rate was listed as 99.7%. He was, in every official sense, a hero. He had helped put criminals away and protected communities, except knew that wasn't the whole story. Judge Richardson hadn't entered yet. The courtroom buzzed with anticipatory energy, walked to the witness box, hyper-aware of every eye following her. She could feel the weight of hundreds of stares. Some were curious, some were hostile. She recognized skepticism in several faces, particularly among the prosecution team. They had already filed 3 motions to exclude her testimony. 3 times the judge had overruled them. This was her moment, and they knew it. Set her briefcase down carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile tension holding the courtroom together. She pulled out her materials, a folder containing printed analyses, graphs, statistics, video documentation. Everything was organized meticulously. Everything was scientifically sound. She had worked with a statistician to ensure her methodology was bulletproof. She had consulted with colleagues at universities across the country. She had submitted her findings for peer review. This was not guesswork, this was science. The bailiff approached. "Doctor, are you ready?" Nodded, not trusting her voice yet. "The judge will be here in 2 minutes," the bailiff said. "You'll be sworn in immediately after." 2 minutes. His mind raced. In 2 minutes her life would change. In 2 minutes she would begin to dismantle the prosecution's case against James, a case that had seemed airtight until her research had poked holes in its foundation. James, a 42-year-old business owner from Salem, had been arrested when officers' traffic stop of his vehicle had resulted in Rex alerting to the presence of narcotics. A subsequent search had found cocaine hidden in the door panel, had maintained his innocence throughout. He had hired David Park, one of Portland's best defense attorneys, who had immediately suspected something was wrong with the dog's alert. That's when Park had contacted. The courtroom doors opened and Judge Richardson entered. Everyone stood. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen countless cases. He settled into his elevated seat and looked over the courtroom with an expression of mild annoyance. Judge Richardson was known for running a tight ship. He did not tolerate nonsense or theatrical displays. He dealt in facts and law. This, realized, was actually to her advantage. The judge was a rational man. He would understand the data. He would understand the science. "We're here for the trial," Judge Richardson announced. "I believe the defense wishes to call their first witness." David Park stood. "Yes, Your Honor, we call doctor to the stand." Stood, her legs surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. She walked to the witness box and placed her hand on the Bible that the bailiff held out. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the bailiff asked. "I do," said. Her voice was clear, calm, professional. She sat down. The judge looked at her over his glasses. "Doctor, you understand you're under oath?" "I do, Your Honor." "Good. You may proceed, Mr. Park." David Park approached and the questioning began. He walked her through her credentials methodically, establishing her authority. Ph.D. from UC Davis in animal behavior, 15 years of professional experience, published research in 7 peer-reviewed journals, consulting work with animal welfare organizations worldwide. With each credential listed, watched the jury lean forward slightly. By the time Park finished the preliminary questions, she could feel the jury's perception shifting. She was no longer just a woman making accusations. She was an expert, a scientist, someone worthy of attention. Then came the crucial question. "Doctor, have you reviewed the evidence in the case?" "I have," said. "And based on your analysis, do you have an opinion regarding the reliability of Rex's alert?" Took a breath. This was it, the moment before everything changed. "Yes," she said, "I do have an opinion, and it's going to challenge everything everyone believes about this case." The courtroom fell completely silent. The email arrived on a Tuesday evening in late September, just as was preparing to close her veterinary clinic for the day. She'd been cleaning the examination rooms, the smell of antiseptic filling her nostrils as she wiped down stainless steel tables. Her assistant, Jenny, had already left for the day, leaving alone with the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a dog barking from the boarding area. Was tired, the kind of tired that comes from a long day of dealing with anxious pet owners and their various ailments. She almost didn't check her email. But something made her pause. Maybe it was intuition, maybe it was just habit, pulled out her phone and opened her email application. The message was from someone named David Park and the subject line read, "Urgent, Police K9 case consultation request." Her first instinct was to delete it. She received dozens of consultation requests every month, most of them from people with minimal understanding of animal behavior, wanting her to validate some half-baked theory or settle a dispute about their neighbor's dog. But something about this email was different. The tone was measured, professional, respectful. She read it carefully. David Park introduced himself as a criminal defense attorney based in Portland. He had been reviewing cases involving a police dog named Rex and his handler, Officer. Park had noticed something troubling. In case after case where Rex had alerted, the evidence seemed almost too perfect, the convictions almost too certain. As someone trained to be skeptical, Park had developed a hypothesis. What if Rex's alerts weren't as reliable as the prosecution claimed? What if there was something else going on? He'd done some preliminary research and discovered work on handler bias in detection dogs. Her published papers on the subject were, he wrote, exactly the kind of scientific analysis I believe this situation requires. Read the email 3 times. Her first response was skepticism. Her second response was curiosity. By the third reading, she was already forming questions. She responded to David Park that same evening, agreeing to review the case files. She told herself she was just being thorough, just doing due diligence. She had no idea that this decision would alter the trajectory of her entire life. The files arrived via secure courier the following day, had cleared space in her home office, a small room lined with, dominated by a large desk and a high-end computer setup. She had invested in this equipment specifically for her research work, and now she would use it for something she had never anticipated, potentially dismantling a case built on police evidence. Started with the police reports. Officer's record was impeccable. He'd been with the K-9 unit for 9 years. His commendations were numerous. Rex's statistics were remarkable: 247 successful drug detections over 7 years, with only 3 alerts that hadn't resulted in drug discoveries. Those 3 alerts, the reports explained, had been classified as false positives caused by residual narcotics contamination at the locations where they occurred. It was, on paper, an incredibly impressive record. But had learned long ago not to trust paper. She requested video footage. That first night, alone at her desk with a cup of tea gone cold beside her, pulled up the first video file. It was security camera footage from a highway traffic stop approximately 2 years ago. The video was grainy but watchable. It showed officer pulling over a silver sedan. She watched him approach the vehicle, speak to the driver, then return to his patrol car with the driver's license. A few minutes later, officer exited his car with Rex on a leash. Watched Rex intently. The dog trotted beside his handler, alert and focused. Officer walked Rex around the vehicle in what appeared to be a standard drug detection pattern. The dog's nose worked constantly, sniffing the air and the vehicle's exterior. Then, on the third pass, Rex suddenly alerted, a sudden shift in his body language, a focused intensity on the rear passenger door. Officer immediately called for backup and requested a search warrant. Within 15 minutes, narcotics were discovered hidden in the door panel. Rewound the video. She watched it again and again. On the 4th viewing, she noticed something. Just before Rex alerted, there had been a barely perceptible change in officer's body. It was subtle, a slight tightening of his shoulders, a shift in his weight. Nothing obvious. Nothing that anyone not specifically trained in behavioral analysis would notice. But it was there. His pulse quickened. She made a note and moved to the next video. The second video showed a different traffic stop, different location, different vehicle, but remarkably similar circumstances. Watched officer approach the vehicle, execute the drug detection protocol, and there it was again. Just before Rex alerted, a subtle shift in his body language, the tightening of shoulders, the shift in breathing, nothing overt, nothing intentional, but it was there. Spent the next 8 hours watching videos. She didn't eat. She didn't drink water. She simply sat at her desk, watching and rewatching, taking meticulous notes. By the time the sun rose the next morning, she had reviewed 17 traffic stops. In 15 of them, she had identified the same pattern. Just before Rex alerted, officer's body sent subtle signals that could unconsciously cue the dog to respond. This was handler bias. She'd written about it in academic papers, but she'd never seen such a clear, documented example. Sat back in her chair, her hands trembling. The implications were staggering. If she was right, then Rex wasn't lying. The dog was simply responding to subtle cues from his handler. It was possible, likely, even, that officer wasn't doing this intentionally. Handler bias could occur completely unconsciously. A handler who believed he was approaching a vehicle where drugs were present might subtly change his behavior in ways that signaled that belief to the dog. The dog, in turn, would respond to those signals rather than to the actual presence of narcotics. But intentional or not, the result was the same: unreliable evidence. Cases built on that evidence would be unsafe convictions. Called David Park that morning. "I need to see more," she said without preamble. "Everything you have, every case involving Officer and Rex. I need the complete record." "You found something?" Park's voice was cautious, hopeful. "I found a pattern," said, "but I need to be absolutely certain before I commit to anything publicly. This is serious, very serious." Over the next 6 weeks, became obsessed. She obtained 43 videos of traffic stops involving Officer and Rex. She developed a standardized system for analyzing them, frame by frame, identifying the subtle behavioral cues that preceded Rex's alerts. She created a database tracking the timeline of each cue and each alert. She calculated statistical probabilities. She consulted with colleagues at 3 different universities who specialized in animal behavior and cognition. Every analysis pointed to the same conclusion: Officer was unconsciously cueing Rex to alert. One night, around midnight, sat at her desk surrounded by printouts and data sheets. She had reviewed every video multiple times. She had run statistical analyses that would satisfy any peer review process. She had documented her methodology meticulously. The evidence was irrefutable. She thought about James sitting in a prison cell, convicted largely on the basis of Rex's alert. She thought about other cases, other convictions, all potentially unsafe. And she thought about the cost of going public with this information. The department would come after her. Her reputation would be questioned. She would be accused of bias, of being anti-police, of helping criminals escape justice. But she couldn't ignore the science. She couldn't ignore the truth. Picked up her phone and called David Park. "I'm ready," she said. "I'll testify. I'll do whatever you need me to do, but I want you to understand, once this starts, there's no going back." "I understand," Park said quietly. "And thank you for having the courage to follow the evidence." She hung up the phone and looked at the wall of data covering her office. One way or another, everything was about to change. First noticed the shift in her daily routine 3 weeks after she'd committed to testifying. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing someone else might have dismissed as coincidence or paranoia. But trained to observe minute details, recognized the pattern immediately. The unmarked car started appearing in her neighborhood around 7 a.m. each morning, parking 2 blocks away from her house. It was always a different model, always parked at a slightly different angle, but there was something deliberate about its presence. The first time she noticed it, she almost convinced herself she was being absurd. But after the 6th time, she knew. Someone was watching her. She photographed the license plate and ran it through a private database. It came back to a company that did lease agreements for various law enforcement agencies. Didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, she received an email from her mentor, Dr. Robert, a retired professor of veterinary behavioral science from Oregon State University. Had guided her career for nearly 2 decades. His email was brief but loaded with concern. "I've been hearing things. People are questioning your methodologies, your objectivity, your motives. I want you to know that I support you entirely, but I also want you to understand the magnitude of what you're doing. This isn't just academia anymore. This is institutional power. Please be careful." Read the email 4 times. The phrase "be careful" echoed in her mind. Careful about what exactly? About her findings? About her testimony? Or about her personal safety? She called Doctor immediately. "What things are you hearing?" she asked without greeting. "Hello to you too," said gently. "Look, I've been in this field for 40 years. I know how it works. There are people who benefit from the current system, and there are people who benefit from challenging it. You're about to challenge it in a very public way. People who benefit from the current system don't like that." "Are they threatening you?" asked, her voice sharp with concern. No, reassured her. "I'm retired. I'm not the one testifying, but you are. And I want you to be aware that this is going to get worse before it gets better, much worse." He was right. The next week, someone keyed her car. Not just a small scratch, someone had carved deep, jagged lines across the entire driver's side. The word traitor was etched into the paint in letters nearly 6 inches tall. Stood in her driveway, staring at the vandalism, and felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was personal. This was a message. She called the police to report it. The officer who responded was polite but unhelpful. "We'll file a report," he said, "but there's not much we can do without evidence or witnesses. These things happen in neighborhoods sometimes." Recognized the dismissiveness in his tone. These things don't just happen. Not like this. Not with that particular word. Her professional life was deteriorating in parallel. A clinic where she'd been doing weekly consultations suddenly canceled all future appointments. No explanation, just a terse email saying they were restructuring and wouldn't need her services anymore. She'd been working with them for 3 years. A veterinary journal that had previously accepted all of her submissions rejected her latest research paper without even sending it to peer review. The editor simply wrote that it didn't align with the journal's current editorial focus. The message was clear: cooperate with the system or be excommunicated from it. But perhaps the most devastating blow came from within her own family. Smother called late one evening, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your father and I have been receiving calls," her mother said. "People saying terrible things. They say you're helping criminals. They say you're betraying law enforcement. What are you doing?" Felt her heart break a little. She had always been close to her parents. Her father had been a mathematics teacher, her mother, a librarian. Both had instilled in her a deep respect for truth and facts, but explaining her research, her findings, her obligations to science seemed impossible over the phone. "Mom, I'm doing the right thing," said quietly. "I promise you I'm doing the right thing." The right thing for whom? Her mother asked, and that question haunted for days. The anonymous messages started appearing more frequently. Her email inbox became a repository of vitriol. "You're a disgrace to your profession. You're going to destroy the careers of good people. Watch your back, people don't forget traitors." Reported the threatening messages to the police. They told her there was nothing they could do unless there was a direct threat of violence. The messages were hostile but not explicitly threatening, they explained. One evening was leaving a grocery store when a woman approached her. The woman was in her 50s, with a hard face and harder eyes. She grabbed his arm firmly. "I'm married to a cop," the woman said, her voice low and intense. "A good cop, and you're about to destroy good people for helping this community. I hope you can live with that." Pulled her arm away, her hands shaking. She went home and locked all her doors and windows, then sat on her couch in the dark, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. The pressure was relentless. One of her closest colleagues, Dr. Winters, who taught at Portland State University, called and essentially demanded that reconsider her position. "The department has connections to the university," explained, clearly uncomfortable. "There's been concern expressed about your work. They're suggesting that if you continue down this path, future collaborations might be difficult. I'm telling you this as your friend. Drop this." "I can't," said. "I can't. The science is clear. The evidence is overwhelming. How can I ignore that?" "Because sometimes," said sadly, "the personal cost is too high." Late one night, recorded a voice memo on her phone. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and needed to remind herself why she was doing this. She sat in her dark office, the light of her computer screen illuminating her face, and spoke into her phone. "They're scared. They're intimidating me because they know I'm right. If I was wrong, they wouldn't care. They wouldn't be threatening me, vandalizing my car, pressuring my colleagues. They're scared because the truth is dangerous to them. The truth challenges their system. The truth means admitting their dog isn't infallible. The truth means convictions might be overturned. The truth costs them something, so they're trying to cost me something in return, but I can't stop now. I won't stop now. There's a man in prison whose life depends on me having the courage to say what I know." She listened to the recording again, and then again. Each time her resolve strengthened slightly. Pulled up the videos of Officer and Rex one more time. She watched Rex's body language, watched subtle cues. She thought about James' family. She thought about the other people potentially imprisoned based on handler bias. She thought about the integrity of the justice system. And she made a decision. Whatever came next, she would see this through. She didn't know that the hardest part was still to come. The district attorney's office moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine designed specifically to discredit. She first learned about their strategy when David Park forwarded her a copy of the motion filed by Assistant District Attorney Thomas. The document was dense with legal language, but the message was unmistakable. The prosecution intended to block her testimony entirely. Read the motion 3 times, her coffee growing cold beside her. Argued that research was speculative, flawed, and fundamentally biased against law enforcement. He claimed she lacked proper scientific credentials for expert witness testimony in criminal proceedings. He suggested that her consulting work with animal welfare organizations created a conflict of interest, implying she had an ideological axe to grind against police departments. The motion concluded by requesting that Judge Richardson exclude her entire testimony from the trial, arguing that allowing it would be prejudicial to the defendant and confusing to the jury. "They're going to fight this hard," David Park said when they spoke by phone that afternoon. "Is one of the best trial lawyers in the state. He doesn't make mistakes and he doesn't give up easily. This is just the opening salvo." Was beginning to understand the nature of institutional power in ways she never had before. The prosecution wasn't simply going to present counterarguments in court. They were going to systematically dismantle her credibility before she ever took the stand. The first salvo came through the media. 2 days after the motion was filed, an article appeared in the Portland Gazette with the headline, "Expert Witness in Trial Has History of Anti-Police Activism." The article quoted anonymous law enforcement sources claiming that had been known to harbor anti-police sentiment, and that her research was designed to undermine legitimate law enforcement operations. One source alleged that had consulted with radical animal rights groups that view police work as inherently cruel. Had never consulted with any animal rights group, radical or otherwise. She had worked with mainstream animal welfare organizations focused on humane treatment standards. But the distinction was lost in the inflammatory language of the article. Her phone began ringing immediately. News outlets wanted interviews. Most were respectful, but several were clearly angling for a juicy conflict narrative. By evening, Smith's name was trending on local social media with comments ranging from supportive to viciously hostile. Threads speculated about her motivations. Facebook groups organized against her testimony. Someone created a website listing her name, address, and professional affiliations under a header reading "Anti-Police Activist. Know who's against your community's protection." Reported the website to authorities. They said there was nothing they could do. The next morning, 3 detectives appeared at her veterinary clinic. They had badges, notepads, and expressions of bureaucratic concern. They informed that they were investigating her research methods as part of a routine inquiry. They asked intrusive questions about her data collection process, her collaboration with David Park, her communications with other experts. They insinuated that she might be committing fraud by presenting unreliable methodology as science. Staff watched nervously as the detectives occupied her waiting room for 3 hours. Clients canceled appointments. One regular client, a woman with a nervous greyhound that had been treating for anxiety, specifically requested a different veterinarian. "I don't want to be associated with someone like that," the woman had said, though never learned exactly what "like that" meant. By the end of the week, had lost 6 regular clients. The prosecution filed 2 additional motions to exclude her testimony, each with slightly different arguments but the same essential goal: keep her off the stand. Judge Richardson the first 2 motions, but could tell he was wavering. On the eve of the 3rd motion hearing, she called David Park in a state of near panic. "He's going to exclude me," she said, her voice shaking. "Judge Richardson is going to exclude my testimony, and this whole thing will fall apart." "Maybe," Park admitted, "but we have to prepare for the hearing as if he won't. I need you to be strong. They're going to attack you, they're going to question everything about you, and you have to hold firm." The hearing lasted 6 hours. Thomas presented an illegal intimidation. He called expert witnesses of his own, behaviorists from law enforcement training programs who that handler bias was a theoretical concern without practical application in real-world police work. He presented statistics showing Rex's successful drug detections. He implied that research was cherry-picking data to support a predetermined conclusion. When took the stand to defend her methodology, attacked relentlessly. "Doctor, isn't it true that you've never worked directly with a police K-9 unit?" he asked, his tone suggesting this was an obvious disqualification. "That's correct," replied evenly, "but I have studied behavioral patterns in hundreds of working dogs across multiple disciplines." "But not police dogs specifically, correct?" "Not directly, but the principles of animal behavior are universal across." "Yes or no, doctor, you have not worked with police K-9 units, have you?" "No." Smiled as if had just confessed to fraud. He questioned her statistical methodology, suggesting that her sample size was too small. He challenged her video analysis, arguing that she had cherry-picked examples that supported her hypothesis, while ignoring the thousands of instances where Rex had alerted without any handler cues. He insinuated that her consulting relationship with animal welfare groups had created an inherent bias against law enforcement. Defended herself calmly, but she could see the judge's expression shifting. She could sense doubt creeping in. Judge Richardson took the matter under advisement, promising a ruling within 48 hours. Those 48 hours were the longest of life. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She sat at her desk, surrounded by her research, wondering if all of this had been for nothing. She thought about James sitting in his cell, unaware that his potential freedom rested on a judge's decision about her credibility. The night before the judge's ruling, received a call from her ex-boyfriend, Michael, a former police officer. They'd broken up 2 years ago, but they'd remained cordial. Now his voice was cold. "I'm calling to tell you that some people from the department have been reaching out to mutual friends, asking questions about you," he said. "They're telling people you're unstable, that you have an agenda. I wanted you to know that, and I also wanted to tell you that if you knew what was good for you, you'd drop this." "Michael, I'm not finished. These are good people you're attacking. These are cops who go out every day to keep our communities safe, and you're trying to make them look like criminals. Think about that." He hung up before she could respond. Sat in the darkness of her apartment, Michael's words echoing in her mind. She thought about the officers, the institution, the power structures she was challenging. She thought about the cost, to her career, to her reputation, to her relationships. She thought about the risk. And then she pulled out her laptop and looked at the videos one more time. She watched officers' subtle movements. She watched Rex respond to those movements rather than to actual narcotics. She looked at the statistical analysis, the peer review comments, the data she'd compiled so carefully. The science was clear. The truth was undeniable. When Judge Richardson's ruling came the next morning, it was the answer had been holding her breath for. Her testimony would be allowed. The judge found her methodology sound and her expertise relevant. But the ruling came with a caveat. The weight and credibility of doctor's testimony will be determined by the jury. In other words, Judge Richardson had allowed her testimony, but had essentially told the jury to be skeptical. Sat in her office, staring at the ruling, and understood for the first time that winning one battle did not mean the war was over. The prosecution had lost the motion to exclude her, but they had succeeded in something equally important. They had planted seeds of doubt about her credibility in the minds of everyone who mattered. Now she had one final chance to overcome that doubt. One chance to convince the jury that despite everything the prosecution had thrown at her, despite the attacks on her character and her methodology, her testimony was trustworthy. One chance to tell the truth. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, and spectators lined the walls standing shoulder to shoulder. The energy was electric, anticipatory, charged with the knowledge that something significant was about to happen. Journalists occupied the front row, their cameras and recording devices positioned strategically. Court sketchers had their pencils poised. Judge Richardson sat elevated above it all, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. Entered through the side door, walking past Officer and Rex. The dog looked up at her with those intelligent amber eyes. For a moment, felt a pang of sympathy for the animal. Rex wasn't a villain in this story. Rex was simply a dog doing what his handler had trained him to do, responding to signals he'd been conditioned to recognize. The villainy, if it existed at all, lay not with the animal but with the system, with human choices, human biases, human failures. She took the oath again, placing her hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the truth. The bailiff's voice was formal and final. "So help you God." "I do," said, and then she sat down. David Park approached with the measured confidence of a lawyer who knew he held good cards. He began not with the controversial evidence but with credentials, methodically establishing her authority. It was a calculated strategy. Build the jury's confidence in her expertise first, then challenge their assumptions about the case. "Doctor, can you tell the jury about your background in animal behavior research?" Park asked. Had prepared for this question hundreds of times. She spoke clearly, systematically describing her PhD program at UC Davis, her research on animal cognition, her published papers. She mentioned her work with service dog organizations, her consulting on animal training methodologies, her 15 years of professional experience. With each credential listed, she watched the jurors' body language shift. They were beginning to see her not as the controversial anti-police activist that the media had portrayed, but as a legitimate scientist with genuine expertise. "Doctor, how many peer-reviewed articles have you published?" Park asked. 17, replied. "In journals including the Journal of Applied Animal Behavior Analysis, the American Journal of Veterinary Research and Behavioral Ecology." "And have any of these articles been rejected or retracted?" "No, all have been accepted and published in their original or revised form." The prosecution's table looked increasingly uncomfortable. Park then shifted to the core of the case. He walked through her investigation process step by step, how David Park had initially contacted her, how she developed her methodology, how she'd analyzed the video evidence, explained her process in language that was scientific but accessible. She was speaking to jurors, not to an academic conference. "Doctor, can you explain to the jury what handler bias is?" Park asked. Took a breath. This was the crucial moment. If she couldn't make them understand handler bias, everything else would fail. Handler bias occurs when a handler unconsciously communicates expectations to a detection dog through subtle body language cues, explained. The handler may genuinely believe the dog is detecting narcotics when, in fact, the dog is responding to the handler's own behavioral signals. This isn't the dog lying. It's the dog doing exactly what it's been trained to do, responding to its handler's cues. But those cues are communicating expectations rather than actual drug detection. She paused, letting that sink in. "It's important to understand," continued, "that this happens unconsciously in most cases. The handler isn't deliberately signaling the dog. Their body is sending messages their conscious mind doesn't even realize are being sent. And the dog, with its incredibly sensitive perception, picks up on those signals immediately. Park walked to the evidence table and retrieved a tablet. He pulled up the first video, the traffic stop from 2 years ago. The courtroom fell silent as the video played on a large screen visible to everyone, narrated what the jury was watching. Here we see officer approaching the vehicle. Notice his body language is neutral. He's calm, professional. He retrieves the driver's license and returns to his vehicle. Now watch carefully as he exits the vehicle with Rex. Notice how his shoulders are relaxed. His breathing appears normal. The video continued. Rex began his detection pattern around the vehicle. Now, said, pointing at the screen, watch officer's body. Watch what happens 3 seconds before Rex alerts. Every eye in the courtroom focused on the video. And there it was, unmistakable in the clear video footage. A sudden tightening in officer's shoulders, a subtle shift in his stance, a change in his breathing pattern. It was so slight that casual viewers might have missed it entirely, but when pointed it out, it became impossible to unsee. At this precise moment, said, officer's body sends a signal to Rex, and immediately, watch, Rex alerts to the door panel. The screen went silent. The prosecution's lead attorney, Thomas, was making notes furiously, but his expression suggested he already knew this wasn't going well. Doctor, Park said, is it possible that officer was signaling the dog because he actually detected the smell of narcotics himself? No, said firmly, because human olfactory capabilities are dramatically inferior to canine olfaction. We cannot smell narcotics from across a parking lot or through vehicle doors. Officer was not smelling drugs. He was signaling his expectation to Rex based on some other factor, perhaps suspicion of the driver, perhaps some perceived inconsistency in the driver's behavior, perhaps dozens of other factors. But he was communicating expectation, not actual detection. Park then walked through video after video. Each one followed the same pattern, would identify the precise moment of officer's behavioral shift. She would point out how that shift preceded Rex's alert. She would explain the statistical improbability of this pattern occurring randomly. By the fourth video, several jury members had shifted forward in their seats, their complete attention focused on and the evidence she was presenting. By the eighth video, one juror was actually shaking her head slightly, as if in disbelief at what she was witnessing. Finally, Park asked the crucial question, Doctor, based on your analysis, what is your professional opinion regarding the reliability of officer's police dog as a detection tool? The courtroom held its breath. My professional opinion, said, speaking slowly and deliberately, is that officer unconsciously cues his police dog to alert through subtle behavioral signals. The dog is not independently detecting narcotics. The dog is responding to handler expectations. Therefore, any evidence obtained based on this dog's alert is unreliable and potentially represents a wrongful identification. The prosecution's table exploded into frantic activity. Whispered conversations, note passing, stood up, ready to begin his cross-examination, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. But before he could speak, continued. Furthermore, she said, her voice steady and clear, this pattern has severe implications for all cases involving officer and this dog. If my analysis is correct, and the video evidence supports that it is, then potentially dozens of convictions may be based on unreliable evidence. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Judge Richardson banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. The jurors had heard her. They had seen the evidence, and could see in their faces that something had shifted in their understanding of the case. Thomas stood, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his demeanor calculated to project confidence. But as he looked across the courtroom, as he looked at the video evidence on the screen, as he looked at the jury members' expressions, He seemed to understand that his cross-examination, however skillful, had an almost impossible task ahead. He would need to make jurors unsee what they had just seen. He would need to make them doubt what the video had clearly shown. He would need to convince them that his analysis was wrong despite the methodical, scientific, and visually obvious evidence she had presented. As approached the stand, felt a strange calm settle over her. She had done what she came to do. She had told the truth. The rest was now in the hands of the jury and the judge. But the hardest part of her testimony was still to come. Step down from the witness stand and return to the gallery where David Park sat. She expected to feel relief, but instead she felt only a strange, hollow exhaustion. Her testimony was over. The hard part was done, or so she thought. Park leaned over and whispered, "That was extraordinary. The jury is completely engaged." Nodded without responding. She was watching the jury members' faces, trying to read their reactions. Some seemed convinced. Others still looked skeptical. One man in the back row had his arms crossed defensively across his chest. The battle for their minds was far from over. The prosecution rested their case. The defense called two more expert witnesses, a forensic psychologist who about unconscious bias in human decision-making, and a veterinary neurologist who explained the sensitivity of canine olfactory systems and how easily they could be misdirected by handler cues. Both built on testimony, providing additional scientific support for her conclusions. Then came the closing arguments. Thomas stood before the jury with the confidence of a man who believed he still controlled the narrative. He acknowledged testimony, but suggested it was speculative interpretation of ambiguous video footage. He emphasized Rex's long track record of success. He suggested that James was simply a criminal trying to escape justice through a hired expert with an anti-police agenda. "Ladies and," said, his voice resonating through the courtroom, "the evidence is clear. Narcotics were found in Mr.'s vehicle. Officer followed proper protocols. Rex alerted. The drugs were discovered. These are facts. Everything else, all this talk about handler bias and subtle cues and unconscious signaling, is theoretical sophistry designed to confuse you and prevent justice." David Park stood next. He walked the jury through his testimony methodically, reminding them of the video evidence, the multiple examples, the statistical improbability of coincidence. He didn't attack Officer's character. Instead, he reframed the issue. This isn't about blaming Officer. This is about recognizing that even good, dedicated officers can unconsciously communicate expectations to their dogs. This is about science. This is about ensuring that our justice system is based on reliable evidence, not on ambiguous indicators that can be misinterpreted. Park paused, letting his gaze sweep across the jury. "And if we allow unreliable evidence to stand in this case, we send a message that science doesn't matter. We send a message that video evidence doesn't matter. We send a message that unconscious bias is acceptable in our courts. I ask you to reject that message. I ask you to insist on reliability. I ask you to demand that the evidence supporting a man's conviction actually be what it appears to be." Judge Richardson gave his jury instructions. He explained the law, the burden of proof, the standard of reasonable doubt. He instructed them on how to evaluate expert testimony. Then he sent them to deliberate. The jury was out for 18 hours. 18 hours of agonizing uncertainty. Sat in the courthouse hallway, barely able to eat or drink. She checked her phone constantly, as if news would arrive by text message. She replayed her testimony over and over in her mind, wondering what she could have said better, where she might have lost the jury's confidence. David Park tried to reassure her. 18 hours is good, he said. It means they're taking this seriously. If they were going to convict quickly, they would have done it by now. They're wrestling with the evidence. That's exactly what we want. But wasn't comforted. She knew that juries were unpredictable. She knew that despite the evidence, despite the videos, despite her testimony, they could still choose to convict. People often believed what they wanted to believe, especially when it was easier to believe the institutional narrative than to challenge it. On the afternoon of the second day, a note came from the jury room. "We have reached a verdict." The courtroom filled immediately. Every seat was taken. Journalists stood along the walls with recording devices ready. Officer sat with the prosecution team, his expression unreadable. James sat with his defense team, his face pale with anxiety. Found herself holding her breath as everyone took their positions. Judge Richardson entered. The jury filed in behind him and searched their faces for any indication of which way they had decided. But jury training programs teach jurors not to reveal their verdicts through their expressions, and these jurors had taken that training seriously. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Richardson asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman said. He was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and an expression of grave seriousness. "Please read the verdict," the judge instructed. The bailiff collected the verdict form from the foreman and brought it to Judge Richardson. The judge read it silently, his face revealing nothing. He handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to the foreman. "On the charge of possession with intent to distribute cocaine, how do you find the defendant, James? Guilty or not guilty?" The courtroom held its collective breath. His heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. "Not guilty," the foreman said. The courtroom erupted. James collapsed into his chair, tears streaming down his face. His attorneys embraced him. The gallery erupted in whispers and comments. Judge Richardson banged his gavel, calling for order. Officer's face had gone pale. The prosecution team looked stunned, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. But the verdict meant something deeper than James' freedom. The jury had accepted testimony. They had believed her analysis. They had found officers' handler bias credible enough to create reasonable doubt. They had essentially said, "We don't trust Rex's alert anymore because we don't trust that it was based on drug detection rather than handler cueing." It was a validation of her work, her courage, and her willingness to speak truth despite enormous pressure. After the trial concluded and the jury was dismissed, stood in the courthouse hallway, still processing what had happened. Several jurors approached her as they left, thanking her for her testimony. One older woman said, "What you did took courage. I hope you know that." An hour later, as was preparing to leave the courthouse, she noticed something unusual. David Park was speaking in hushed tones with a woman didn't recognize. The woman had a folder in her hands and an expression of urgent concern. Park's face was grave as he listened. After the woman left, Park turned to with a troubling expression. "That was a representative from the district attorney's office," he said quietly. "She told me something off the record. There are potentially 83 cases, where Officer and Rex's alerts were the primary evidence supporting convictions." Felt her knees weaken. 83 people. 83 potential wrongful convictions based on handler bias she had just exposed. "What does that mean?" she asked, though she already knew. "It means your testimony didn't end this," Park said. "It just started something much bigger. There are going to be appeals. There are going to be retrials. There are going to be investigations. And there are going to be people very angry about what you've revealed." Looked out the courthouse windows at the Portland skyline. She had won the battle against James' conviction, but she had inadvertently opened a much larger battlefield. She had exposed systemic problems that powerful people would prefer to keep hidden. She had no idea that the most dramatic moment of all was still coming, a moment that would occur not in a courtroom, but in a much more unexpected place, with consequences that would ripple far beyond this single case. She thought about what lay ahead, the angry reactions, the institutional pushback, the attempts to discredit her findings. But she also thought about the 83 people who might now have a chance at justice they didn't have before. took a deep breath and stepped out into the Portland afternoon, ready for whatever came next. The media frenzy began the moment the verdict was announced. Within hours, his face was plastered across local news outlets. The headlines varied depending on the publication's perspective. Expert witness overturns drug conviction appeared in progressive media outlets, while defense expert casts doubt on police dog evidence ran in more conservative publications. One particularly inflammatory headline read, "Controversial behaviorist undermines law enforcement trust." By the next morning was a national story. She received calls from the New York Times, NPR, CNN. Everyone wanted an interview. Everyone wanted her to explain what she had discovered. Unprepared for this level of attention, spent the first few days in a daze, refusing most requests while her attorney, David Park, fielded the inquiries. But the real consequences began internally, within the criminal justice system. On the third day after the verdict, the district attorney's office announced a comprehensive audit of all cases involving Officer and his police dog, Rex. The announcement was framed carefully. In light of recent testimony suggesting potential concerns about handler-dog interactions, we are conducting a thorough review of all cases involving Officer's K-9 unit to ensure public confidence in our prosecutions. It was bureaucratic language designed to minimize scandal, but the meaning was clear. They were reviewing 83 convictions. Received a call from the district attorney herself, Morton, a woman had never met but whose office had spent months trying to discredit her. "Dr. Morton said, her voice carefully neutral, "I want you to know that we take these concerns seriously. We're conducting a full review of the cases in question. However, I also want to make clear that we believe Officer acted in good faith and that the vast majority of his investigations will likely withstand scrutiny." "I hope you're right," replied, though she suspected otherwise. What followed was a legal earthquake that rippled through the Portland legal system and beyond. Within 2 weeks, 3 defendants filed motions for new trials based on findings. Within a month, that number had grown to 11. Defense attorneys across Oregon were citing research in their motions. The defense bar recognized they had been handed a powerful weapon, and they were deploying it strategically. By the end of the second month, 6 convictions had been overturned entirely. The charges against 4 defendants were dismissed. 2 more were granted new trials. These weren't just drug possession cases. They were felonies including trafficking, conspiracy, and other serious charges. One of the overturned cases involved a woman named Martinez, who had served 4 years of a 7-year sentence for drug distribution. She had maintained her innocence throughout her incarceration. The drugs found in her car had been the only evidence against her, drugs that Rex had allegedly detected. When her case was reviewed in light of testimony, the conviction was vacated. Was released on a Tuesday afternoon. When she emerged from the courthouse, she walked directly to where was standing and embraced her, weeping. "Thank you," said over and over. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for telling the truth." Held the woman, feeling the weight of the moment. This was real. This wasn't abstract. This woman's life had been imprisoned based on unreliable evidence, and testimony had helped free her. But if there was justice in these reversals, there was also chaos and institutional upheaval. Officer was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Investigators reviewed his entire career, not just his work with Rex but his conduct in general. Anonymous allegations surfaced, officers suggesting had a history of planting evidence or manipulating investigations. Nothing was proven, but the accusation alone was damaging. His career, which had seemed solid just weeks earlier, was now in ruins. The Portland Police Department faced enormous pressure. Police unions defended, arguing that he was being made a scapegoat for a systemic issue that wasn't unique to him. But the department itself realized they had a catastrophic public relations problem. Their K-9 unit, once celebrated as a model program, was now viewed with suspicion. The department announced new protocols for K-9 verification, implementing independent confirmation procedures for drug detection alerts. But this also meant that thousands of past cases involving K-9 alerts would need to be re-examined. The costs, legal and financial, were staggering. His professional life transformed in ways both positive and negative. Universities invited her to give lectures. The American Bar Association asked her to contribute to new guidelines for K-9 evidence. Law firms across the country contacted her about consulting on cases involving police dog evidence. Her research, previously niche academic work, was now in high demand. But the hostility intensified as well. Someone spray-painted "liar" across her veterinary clinic. She received hate mail with messages like, "You're helping criminals and destroying heroes, and you'll burn in hell for what you've done." One envelope contained a photograph of her address with a red target drawn over it. She reported it to the FBI. Her professional relationships fractured. Colleagues who had previously been friendly became distant or openly hostile. One former collaborator published an article questioning his methodology and suggesting she had allowed her ideological bias to compromise her scientific judgment. The article wasn't peer-reviewed. It was published in a blog associated with law enforcement advocacy groups. But perhaps most painfully, his relationship with her parents reached a breaking point. Her father, who had been a mathematics teacher and who prided himself on logic and reason, called her one evening. His voice was strained. "Your mother and I have been receiving calls from people in the community. They're saying you're anti-police. They're saying you've betrayed the people who keep us safe. I defended you when they called, but I need to understand. Why did you feel compelled to do this? Why didn't you just stay out of it?" Felt tears in her eyes. "Dad, because the science demanded it," she said. "Because I couldn't ignore what I found. Because innocent people were in prison." "At what cost?" her father asked quietly. "You have people threatening you. Your reputation is damaged. And for what? To prove a point. To make a political statement." "Not a political statement," said. "The truth, just the truth." But the truth, she was learning, was rarely simple or painless. By the 6-month mark, 12 more convictions had been overturned. The district attorney's office had completed their audit and found that, in 37 cases, they felt there was sufficient doubt about the reliability of Rex's alerts to recommend either dismissal or new trials. The remaining cases, they argued, had corroborating evidence that would support conviction even without the K-9 alert. But the damage was done. The credibility of the entire K-9 unit was compromised. Other police departments across the country began reviewing their own K-9 procedures. Some agencies discovered similar patterns of handler bias. Others implemented the new verification protocols that Portland had developed. James, freed from his conviction, became an advocate for criminal justice reform. He started a nonprofit called Innocence, dedicated to identifying and helping wrongfully convicted individuals. He often appeared at press conferences with, and their partnership became symbolic of the possibility for change. Was invited to speak at the American Bar Association annual conference. She stood before thousands of lawyers, judges, and legal professionals, explaining her findings and their implications. She was not bitter or triumphant. Instead, she was measured and reflective. "This wasn't about proving police wrong," she said from the podium. "It was about ensuring our system relies on science, not assumption. We need to trust law enforcement, but we also need to verify that evidence is what it appears to be. We need to create systems where unconscious bias, which can happen to anyone, doesn't lead to wrongful convictions." The applause was substantial, but not universal. Could see some people in the audience with their arms crossed, their expressions skeptical or disapproving. After her speech, an older judge approached her. He had gray hair and kind eyes, and he carried himself with quiet authority. "What you did took exceptional courage," he told her. I've been on the bench for 32 years, and I can tell you that speaking truth to institutional power is the hardest thing anyone can do, but it's also the most necessary thing. Thank you." Thanked him and they parted, but his words stayed with her, the hardest thing but also the most necessary. She had won a victory but not a clean one. She had exposed corruption and freed innocent people, but she had also damaged careers, divided communities, and paid a significant personal price. Justice, she understood now, was messy and complicated. It wasn't something that could be delivered neatly at the end of a trial. It was, instead, an ongoing struggle, one where speaking truth meant accepting consequence, and where doing the right thing didn't always lead to a happy ending, even when it led to the correct one. 2 years after his testimony in the trial, she sat in her office at the University of Washington, where she now held a tenured position as professor of forensic animal behavior. The office was lined with books, research papers, and framed photographs. One photograph showed her standing with James at the opening of his nonprofit. Another showed her accepting the Science in Service Award from the National Academy of Sciences. But the photograph that meant the most to her was simple and unframed. It was a screenshot of an email from a man named David Torres, who had been convicted on the basis of Rex's alert 7 years ago and had served 4 years in prison before his testimony led to his release. In the email, David wrote, "I got hired today at a good company. I have a job interview scheduled for a promotion next month. I'm getting my life back. Thank you for giving it to me." Had printed that email and carried it in her wallet ever since. The national impact of her work had far exceeded anything she could have predicted. Within 18 months of the verdict, 17 states had adopted revised K-9 verification protocols based on the procedures Portland had implemented. 7 states had launched independent audits of cases involving police dogs, modeled on the comprehensive review Oregon had conducted. The FBI had convened a task force to develop federal guidelines for K-9 evidence and had been invited to serve on it. But perhaps most significantly, the American Bar Association had published new guidelines for expert testimony involving animal behavior. These guidelines explicitly addressed handler bias and required that any K-9 evidence be corroborated by independent verification, either video evidence of actual drug detection or independent confirmation of the dog's alert by another handler without knowledge of the case details. The legal landscape had shifted, not dramatically enough to satisfy all reformers, but significantly enough that could see real change taking root. At the state level, Oregon's district attorney had completed her comprehensive audit. The final report was sobering. Of the 83 cases reviewed, 42 convictions were recommended for dismissal or reconsideration. 21 additional cases had new trials granted on appeal. Only 20 cases were deemed to have sufficient corroborating evidence to withstand the handler bias challenges. By the time the audit concluded, 38 people had been released from incarceration based on flawed K-9 evidence. 38 people, 38 lives restored, 38 families reunited. Officer had resigned from the police department rather than face a termination hearing. He had moved to another state and disappeared from public view. Harbored no animosity toward him. She understood that he had likely acted without any conscious awareness of his bias. But she also understood that the consequences of unconscious actions could be devastating, and that institutional systems needed to be designed to catch such errors before they resulted in wrongful convictions. The Portland Police Department, initially defensive, had eventually embraced reform. The new chief had reached out to personally and asked her to help develop training protocols for K-9 handlers specifically designed to minimize unconscious cueing. Had agreed, and over the following year, she had worked extensively with the K-9 unit to implement behavioral awareness training and verification procedures. The most important thing, had told the handlers during one training session, is to understand that this isn't about blame. This is about recognizing that we're all susceptible to bias. I'm susceptible to it. You're susceptible to it. The difference between a reliable investigative tool and an unreliable one is recognizing that susceptibility and building systems to counteract it. Chief had been receptive to this framing, and the department's willingness to engage in genuine reform had earned them respect in the legal and criminal justice communities. Other departments looked to Portland as a model for how to respond to systemic problems honestly and constructively. Research had continued to flourish. She published 3 peer-reviewed papers on handler bias in detection dogs, including one co-authored with independent researchers from 3 universities. These papers had been cited hundreds of times in legal proceedings and scientific publications. Universities invited her to deliver lectures. Graduate students sought her out as an advisor. She had become, quite unexpectedly, one of the leading authorities in a newly recognized field, the forensic analysis of animal behavior in criminal justice contexts. But success brought its own complications. There were still people who viewed her as a traitor to law enforcement. At a national police conference, she had been openly booed during a panel discussion about K-9 evidence. Some police unions continued to argue that her research was anti-police, and that accepting her findings represented a capitulation to criminal defense advocates. A few law enforcement publications ran articles suggesting that her work had undermined public safety and allowed dangerous criminals to escape justice. These criticisms stung, even though they were often based on incomplete understanding of her work. She had never claimed that all K-9 alerts were unreliable. She had never argued that police dogs shouldn't be used in law enforcement. She had simply identified a specific problem, handler bias, and proposed solutions. But nuance was often lost in political and institutional conflicts. Her family relationships had slowly improved, though they would never return to their previous ease. Her father had attended one of her lectures at a public library and had afterward embraced her, tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry I doubted you," he had said. "I understand now what you were doing and why you had to do it. I'm proud of you." Her mother had become, unexpectedly, one of his most vocal supporters. She had joined the board of James' nonprofit, Innocence, and had spent countless hours helping recently released prisoners navigate re-entry into society. James himself had become a close friend and collaborator. Together, they had written an op-ed for the New York Times titled "Justice Delayed is Justice: The Cost of Unreliable Evidence." They had spoken together at law schools and conferences, with providing the human face of wrongful conviction and providing the scientific explanation for how such convictions occurred. The nonprofit had grown into a significant force in criminal justice reform. With its expertise and advocacy, it had expanded its focus beyond K-9 cases to encompass other forms of unreliable evidence in criminal proceedings. The organization worked with defense attorneys to identify cases where scientific understanding had advanced beyond the understanding that existed at the time of conviction, creating opportunities for exoneration based on newly available evidence or newly understood methodologies. By the 5-year mark after his trial, Innocence had played a role in identifying 47 potential wrongful convictions and had successfully supported the exoneration of 19 individuals. His office at the University of Washington reflected this journey. Her desk held stacks of research papers and case files. One wall displayed photographs of people she had worked with, attorneys, fellow researchers. Another wall held letters from people thanking her for her work. She had received notes from formerly incarcerated individuals expressing gratitude for their freedom. She had received letters from judges thanking her for expanding their understanding of evidence and bias. She had even received a letter from a police officer who had read her research and realized that he, too, had been unconsciously cueing his dog, leading him to completely change his investigative practices. kept a photograph on her desk of the courtroom during that pivotal moment of silence, when she had pointed at Rex and spoken 2 words. She had requested that David Park obtain a copy of the courtroom sketch that had been drawn during her testimony. The artist had captured the exact moment when the jury was beginning to comprehend the implications of her findings. Looked at that sketch regularly as a reminder of how a single moment of courage could catalyze massive change. She thought often about what would have happened if she hadn't spoken up. James would still be in prison. Martinez would still be serving her sentence. David Torres would be struggling as a released prisoner with a criminal record and no support. 38 other people would still be incarcerated unjustly. Officer would still be arresting people based on unreliable evidence, and the system would still be broken, though nobody would have known it. One evening stood in her office looking out the window at the Seattle skyline. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the initial contact from David Park, the months of analysis, the pressure and intimidation, the controversial testimony, the aftermath of both triumph and difficulty. She pulled out her phone and recorded a voice memo, similar to the one she had made years earlier in the depths of the pressure campaign. It's been 5 years. I look back and I don't regret any of it. Yes, there was a cost. There were threats, losses of relationships, professional damage, but the cost of silence would have been higher. 38 people are free because I chose to speak. Systemic changes are occurring because I chose to act, and I would do it again knowing everything I know now. The truth isn't always easy or comfortable, but it's always worth telling. And when the truth can free the innocent and protect the vulnerable, it becomes not just worth telling, it becomes essential. She listened to the recording and saved it, thinking about the young scientist who might someday face similar choices. She wanted them to know that speaking truth to power was difficult but possible. She wanted them to understand that the consequences of silence could be more damaging than the consequences of courage. Turned off her office lights and prepared to leave for the evening. Tomorrow she would meet with a graduate student who was studying handler bias in detection dogs. Next week, she would testify in another case involving K9 evidence. Next month, she would attend a conference where she would present her latest research on improving verification procedures for animal-based detection methods. The work was far from over. The system was still imperfect. There were still wrongful convictions and still institutional resistance to reform. But there was also movement toward justice, toward truth, toward a system that valued science over assumption and evidence over allegation. And it had all started with 2 words spoken in a moment of clarity and courage, when pointed at a police dog and said what needed to be said: handler bias.